Behind the stoic faces and crimson uniforms of the Queen's Guard lies a truth that palace officials rarely discuss. These are not statues carved from stone, but living, breathing human beings with hearts that beat, minds that think, and souls that feel. What happens when the weight of duty collides with the raw power of human emotion? When centuries of tradition crack under the pressure of a single moment that changes everything? The answer lies in the untold stories of men who stood motionless for hours, only to have their world shatter in an instant. Stories of guards who chose humanity over protocol, love over duty, and compassion over centuries-old rules. These are the moments when the unbreakable broke, when the unmovable moved, and when the silent finally spoke. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of Buckingham Palace as Guardsman Michael Thompson took his position outside the main entrance. At 24 years old, he had already served 3 years in the Queen's Guard, mastering the art of becoming invisible while being completely visible. His red tunic was pressed to perfection, his bearskin hat positioned exactly as regulations demanded, and his expression had been carefully molded into the neutral mask that tourists photograph thousands of times each day. Michael had learned early in his training that being a Queen's Guard meant becoming something more than human, yet somehow less. More disciplined, more controlled, more precise than ordinary men, but stripped of the basic human responses that made life meaningful. He couldn't scratch an itch, couldn't swat away a bee, couldn't even acknowledge the existence of the people who gathered around him daily, treating him like an attraction rather than a person. The rules were absolute and unforgiving, no matter what happened around them. The guards were to remain motionless and silent. They had been trained to withstand everything from torrential rain to blazing heat, from aggressive tourists to protesters shouting inches from their faces. Some guards had fainted from heat exhaustion and been quietly replaced without breaking formation. Others had endured hours of mockery, inappropriate touching, and deliberate attempts to make them laugh or react. Michael remembered his first week on duty when a group of teenagers had spent an entire hour trying to get him to smile. They made faces, told jokes, even brought props to wave in front of his face. One particularly persistent girl had stood on her tiptoes and whispered inappropriate comments in his ear while her friends recorded everything on their phones. Through it all, Michael had remained perfectly still, his eyes focused on the middle distance, his breathing controlled and steady. But nothing in his training had prepared him for what would happen on that particular Tuesday morning in September. The day started like any other. Tourists began gathering early, cameras ready to capture the changing of the guard ceremony. Michael took his position at 0800 hours precisely, relieving Guardsman Collins with the practiced efficiency that had become second nature. The early morning crowd was typical for the season, a mix of international tourists, school groups, and local photographers hoping to catch the perfect shot. Michael settled into the familiar rhythm of duty. His mind, trained to remain alert while appearing absent, automatically cataloged potential threats and unusual behavior among the crowd. A man with a suspicious bulge in his jacket turned out to be carrying camera equipment. A woman acting nervously was simply trying to corral 3 young children who kept running in different directions. Everything seemed normal, routine, manageable. The first sign that this day would be different came at around 0930 hours. Michael noticed a commotion near the palace gates, but protocol dictated that he maintain his position and trust the other security personnel to handle whatever was happening. Through his peripheral vision, he could see people running, some toward the disturbance, others away from it. The usual chatter of tourists was replaced by urgent voices and the sound of footsteps on pavement. Then he heard the scream. It wasn't the excited squeal of a tourist or the playful shout of a child. This was something primal, desperate, filled with terror and anguish. The sound cut through the morning air like a blade, causing several people in the crowd to turn their heads sharply toward its source. Michael's training kicked in automatically, his muscles tensing slightly as his mind processed the potential threat, but his body remained perfectly still. The scream came again, closer this time, and Michael could hear words within it. "Help! Someone help my baby!" Every instinct in Michael's body screamed at him to turn his head, to locate the source of distress, to offer assistance. But his training held firm. Queen's Guards do not break formation. Queen's Guards do not respond to civilian emergencies unless directly ordered by a superior officer. Queen's Guards remain at their posts, no matter what chaos erupts around them. Through his peripheral vision, Michael could see people running toward the sound of the screams. Palace security personnel were moving quickly across the courtyard, their radios crackling with urgent communications. But Michael remained frozen in place, a red-coated statue amid the growing chaos. Then he saw her. A young woman, probably in her mid-20s, burst into his field of vision, carrying something in her arms. Her face was streaked with tears, her hair disheveled, and her clothes were soaked with what looked like blood. In her arms, she carried a small child, no more than 3 years old, whose body hung limp and motionless. The woman stumbled as she ran, nearly falling to her knees just a few feet from where Michael stood. She looked around desperately, her eyes wild with panic, seeking help from anyone who might be able to save her child. Her gaze fell on Michael, and for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, their eyes met. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but somehow reaching Michael's ears through all the noise around them. "Please help me. My baby isn't breathing." Michael's heart hammered against his ribs with such force that he was certain it must be visible beneath his uniform. Every fiber of his being wanted to move, to help, to do something, anything to ease this woman's suffering. But the weight of his training, the absolute nature of his orders, and the fear of court-martial held him in place like chains. The woman stared at him for another moment, her expression shifting from desperate hope to confusion, then to something that looked like betrayal. She couldn't understand why this strong young man in uniform wouldn't help her dying child. She couldn't comprehend the invisible bonds that held him motionless even in the face of such obvious human suffering. "Please," she said again, louder this time, her voice cracking with desperation. "I know you can hear me. My baby needs help. Why won't you help us?" Other people in the crowd began to notice the scene unfolding near the guard post. Some stepped forward to offer assistance to the distraught mother, while others turned to stare at Michael with expressions ranging from confusion to disgust. How could he just stand there while a child's life hung in the balance? What kind of man could remain unmoved by such obvious distress? Michael felt the weight of their stares like physical blows. He could hear whispered comments from the crowd, people questioning his humanity, his decency, his basic compassion. Some tourists began taking pictures and videos, capturing what they saw as either admirable discipline or shocking callousness, depending on their perspective. The woman was now sobbing openly, still holding her motionless child, still looking between Michael and the growing crowd of would-be helpers. Palace security and medical personnel were pushing through the crowd, but in that moment, Michael was the closest person to her, the most visible symbol of authority and strength, and yet completely unable to offer the help she so desperately needed. Michael's mind raced through his options. He could break formation and assist, potentially saving a life, but definitely ending his career and facing serious legal consequences. Military regulations were clear about the consequences of abandoning one's post, especially in such a visible and public manner. He could maintain his position and trust that proper medical help would arrive in time, but the child's life might be lost while he stood helpless just feet away. As these thoughts flashed through his mind in the space of seconds, Michael noticed something that made his blood run cold. The child's lips were blue. The small chest wasn't rising and falling with breath. The little arms hung completely limp at the sides. This wasn't just a medical emergency. This was a race against time that might already be lost. The woman seemed to sense the urgency as well. Her sobs became more desperate, and she began shaking the child gently, as if trying to wake him from a deep sleep. "Come on, baby," she whispered. Come on, wake up from mommy. Please wake up. Michael felt tears burning behind his eyes, but even that small display of emotion was forbidden. Queen's guards do not cry. Queen's guards do not show weakness. Queen's guards do not let personal feelings interfere with their duties, no matter how compelling the circumstances. But as Michael watched the scene unfold before him, something deep inside his chest began to crack. The careful conditioning, the months of training, the absolute certainty that had guided his actions for 3 years, all of it began to crumble in the face of one simple truth. A child was dying, and he had the strength and training that might save a life. The woman looked up at him one more time, her eyes now filled with a mixture of desperation and accusation. "I don't understand," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "How can you just stand there? How can you watch my baby die and do nothing?" The words hit Michael like physical blows, each one chipping away at his resolve. He thought about his own nephew, just about the same age as the child in the woman's arms. He thought about his sister, how she would feel if she were in this woman's position. He thought about the oath he had taken when he joined the military, to protect and serve, to defend those who couldn't defend themselves. But he also thought about his fellow guards, the trust they placed in him to maintain the standards that had been upheld for centuries. He thought about the chain of command, the absolute nature of military discipline, the pride that came with being part of something larger than himself. He thought about the consequences of breaking formation, the shame it would bring not just on himself, but on his entire unit. The internal battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Michael could see medical personnel pushing through the crowd, still 20 or 30 feet away, but moving as quickly as they could through the mass of people. He could see other guards maintaining their positions around the palace perimeter, trusting him to do the same. He could see cameras and phones pointed in his direction, ready to capture whatever decision he made. And then the child made a small sound, barely audible, but unmistakably human, a weak moan that indicated life, but also suggested that time was running out. That sound broke something fundamental inside Michael Thompson. In that instant, 3 years of conditioning evaporated like morning mist. The carefully constructed barriers between duty and humanity crumbled completely. Without conscious thought, without considering the consequences, without weighing protocol against compassion, Michael stepped forward and broke formation for the first time in his career. The crowd around him seemed to gasp collectively as the red-coated statue suddenly came to life. Michael dropped to one knee beside the distraught mother, his trained hands automatically checking the child's pulse and breathing. His military medical training, a required component of all Queen's Guard service, kicked in with practiced efficiency. "Ma'am, I need you to lay the child down on the ground," Michael said, his voice calm and professional despite the emotional chaos surrounding the moment. "I have medical training. Let me help." The woman looked at him with a mixture of relief and disbelief, as if she couldn't quite process that the silent statue had suddenly become her potential savior. With trembling hands, she carefully laid her child on the cobblestones, stepping back just enough to give Michael room to work. Michael's hands moved with practiced precision, checking the child's airway, positioning the small head correctly, preparing to administer CPR if necessary. Around him, the crowd had fallen silent, everyone watching this unprecedented moment when duty gave way to human compassion. As Michael worked over the child, he was vaguely aware of the consequences that would follow his decision. His career in the Queen's Guard was almost certainly over. Court-martial proceedings would likely follow. His fellow guards would face questions about the unit's discipline and training. The carefully maintained mystique of the Queen's Guard had been shattered in full view of dozens of tourists with cameras. But none of that mattered as much as the small chest beneath his hands and the desperate hope in a mother's eyes. The child's pulse was weak, but present, a small flutter beneath Michael's fingertips that gave him hope. The little boy's breathing was shallow and irregular, but his airway was clear. As Michael continued his assessment, the child's eyelids fluttered slightly, and a small cough escaped his lips. The mother let out a sob of relief, reaching out toward her son, but stopping herself from interfering with Michael's work. "That's good," Michael said quietly, maintaining his professional demeanor while his own heart raced with adrenaline and fear. "He's responding. Can you tell me what happened?" "We were walking to see the guards," the mother said, her voice shaky but more controlled now that her child was showing signs of life. "Tommy loved the redcoats. He wanted to be a soldier when he grows up. He ran ahead of me toward the fence, and then he just collapsed. He started convulsing, and then he went limp. I thought I'd lost him." Michael nodded, his medical training helping him piece together what had likely occurred. The child appeared to have suffered some kind of seizure, possibly brought on by excitement, heat, or an underlying medical condition. While serious, it was treatable if handled properly and quickly. "Tommy," Michael said gently, addressing the child directly. "Tommy, can you hear me? You're safe now. Your mummy's right here." The child's eyes opened slowly, unfocused and confused, but definitely conscious. A weak whimper escaped his lips as he tried to orient himself to his surroundings. Michael felt a wave of relief wash over him. Whatever had happened, the worst seemed to be over. By now, palace medical personnel had pushed through the crowd and were kneeling beside Michael. The lead medic, a woman in her 40s with short gray hair and efficient movements, took in the scene quickly. "What's the situation?" she asked Michael, speaking to him as one trained professional to another, apparently unbothered by the fact that he had abandoned his post. "Possible seizure," Michael reported, his voice steady and clinical. "Patient is a male child, approximately 3 years old. Found unconscious and unresponsive, weak pulse and shallow breathing, but he's come around in the last minute or so. Airway is clear, pulse is strengthening." The medic nodded approvingly and began her own assessment, pulling medical equipment from her bag. "Good work," she said quietly to Michael. "You may have saved his life by responding so quickly." As the medical team took over Tommy's care, Michael slowly stood up and stepped back. The reality of what he had done was beginning to sink in. Around him, the crowd watched with a mixture of admiration and curiosity. Some people were clapping, others were taking pictures, and a few were wiping tears from their eyes. But Michael's attention was drawn to the other Queen's guards visible around the palace perimeter. He could see Guardsman Williams at the next post, still maintaining perfect formation, but with a subtle tension in his posture that suggested internal conflict. Farther away, Sergeant Major Harrison was walking quickly across the courtyard, his expression unreadable, but his purposeful stride indicating that Michael's breach of protocol had not gone unnoticed by the chain of command. The mother, whose name Michael learned was Sarah, approached him as the medics prepared to transport Tommy to the hospital for further evaluation. Her face was still streaked with tears, but they were tears of relief now rather than desperation. "Thank you," she said simply, reaching out to grasp Michael's hand. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't helped us. I know you're not supposed to move, but you chose to help anyway. That makes you a hero in my book." Michael felt his throat tighten with emotion, but he managed to maintain his composure. "I'm just glad your son is going to be okay," he replied. "He seems like a brave little soldier." Tommy, now conscious and breathing normally though still weak, looked up at Michael with wide, curious eyes. Despite everything he had just been through, the child seemed fascinated by the tall man in the red coat and enormous black hat. "Are you really a Queen's Guard?" Tommy asked, his voice small but clear. "I am," Michael answered, kneeling down to the child's level. "And you know what? You're one of the bravest people I've ever met." Tommy smiled weakly, and for a moment, Michael forgot about regulations and consequences and the weight of centuries of tradition. In that instant, he was simply a man who had helped a child in need, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. As the medics prepared to move Tommy to an ambulance, Sergeant Major Harrison reached the scene. Michael automatically snapped to attention, knowing that this moment would likely determine the immediate consequences of his actions. Guardsman Thompson, the sergeant major said, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades in the military. "Fall out of formation and report to my office immediately." "Yes, sir," Michael replied, his voice steady despite the uncertainty churning in his stomach. But before Michael could step away, Sarah intervened. "Excuse me," she said, addressing the sergeant major directly. "I don't know what the proper procedure is here, but this man saved my son's life. If there's going to be trouble for what he did, then people need to know that he acted to save a child." The sergeant major looked at Sarah for a long moment, then glanced down at Tommy, who was now sitting up on the stretcher but still looked pale and weak. Around them, several tourists were nodding in agreement with Sarah's words, and Michael could see phone cameras still recording the interaction. "Ma'am," the sergeant major said carefully, "I appreciate your concern, and I'm very glad your son is recovering. But military discipline and protocol exist for important reasons that civilians don't always understand. Guardsman Thompson will be treated fairly, but he must answer for his actions according to military law." Michael watched this exchange with growing awareness of how complicated his situation had become. On one hand, he had potentially saved a child's life and acted according to basic human decency. On the other hand, he had violated direct orders and centuries of military tradition in the most public way possible. The incident was being recorded by dozens of people and would likely be shared across social media within hours. As Tommy was loaded into the ambulance, Sarah gave Michael one last grateful look. "I don't care about your military rules," she said loud enough for others to hear. "You did the right thing, and I'll make sure people know that." After the ambulance departed and the crowd began to disperse, Michael found himself walking across the palace courtyard toward what would likely be the most difficult conversation of his military career. The other guards maintained their positions, but Michael could feel their eyes on him as he passed. Some seemed sympathetic, others disapproving, but all were certainly aware that a line had been crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. The sergeant major's office was exactly as Michael remembered from his early days of training. Spartanly furnished, meticulously organized, and intimidating in its efficiency. Harrison gestured for Michael to take a seat across from his desk, then closed the door and activated a recording device. "Guardsman Thompson," he began formally, "you are being questioned regarding your abandonment of post and breach of standing orders while on guard duty at Buckingham Palace on September 15th, 2023 at approximately 0945 hours. Do you understand the nature of these charges?" "Yes, sir," Michael replied, sitting at attention even though he was seated. "Do you wish to have a representative present during this questioning?" "No, sir. I'll answer your questions directly." The sergeant major leaned back in his chair and studied Michael for a moment. When he spoke again, his tone was less formal, though still serious. "Michael, I've known you for 3 years. You've been an exemplary soldier and a credit to the Queen's Guard. Your record is spotless, your discipline has been impeccable, and your fellow guards respect you. So, I need to understand what happened out there today." Michael took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. He had spent the walk to the office thinking about how to explain his actions, but now that the moment had arrived, he found that the truth was both simple and complicated. "Sir, I saw a child who appeared to be dying, and I had the training and position to potentially help. I weighed my duty to maintain my post against my duty as a human being and as someone with medical training to preserve life. In that moment, I chose to act. You understand that Queen's Guards are specifically trained to ignore civilian emergencies and trust other personnel to handle such situations?" "Yes, sir." But medical personnel were still fighting through the crowd, and the child appeared to be in critical condition. Every second mattered. You understand that your actions have been recorded by multiple civilians and will likely be shared widely on social media? "Yes, sir." You understand that this incident calls into question the discipline and reliability of the entire Queen's Guard unit? Michael hesitated before answering this question. He hadn't fully considered how his individual choice might reflect on his fellow guards, and the weight of that responsibility settled on his shoulders. I understand that possibility, sir, but I hope that people will see that the Queen's Guard is composed of human beings who are capable of compassion and quick thinking in emergency situations. The sergeant major made notes on a form as they talked, his expression revealing nothing about his personal thoughts on the situation. After several more questions about the specific timeline of events and Michael's decision-making process, he set down his pen and looked directly at the young guard. Thompson, this is a complex situation that will require review at levels far above my authority. Queen's Guard protocol exists for reasons that go back centuries, but we also serve a monarchy that values compassion and service to the people. Your case will likely become a precedent that affects how we train future guards. Sir, I accept full responsibility for my actions and any consequences that result. I know you do, son, and that's part of what makes this difficult. The sergeant major stood up and moved to the window overlooking the palace courtyard. I've served in the Queen's Guard for 30 years, he said, his voice thoughtful. I've seen guards stand motionless while protesters screamed in their faces, while drunks tried to climb on them, while photographers invaded their personal space in ways that would get civilians arrested. The ability to remain disciplined under pressure is what separates us from ordinary soldiers. He turned back toward Michael. But in 30 years, I've never seen a situation quite like today. A dying child changes the equation in ways that our traditional protocols don't fully address. Michael remained silent, sensing that the sergeant major was working through his own conflicted feelings about the incident. Here's what's going to happen, Harrison continued. You're suspended from guard duty pending a formal review. This review will likely take several weeks and will involve senior officers, palace officials, and possibly representatives from the royal family itself. The media attention from this incident means that whatever decision is made will be closely scrutinized by the public. Understand, sir. In the meantime, you'll report to base for administrative duties. You're not to speak to the media about this incident without explicit authorization. And Thompson, yes, sir. Whatever happens in the review, I want you to know that you showed courage today. Not just the courage to break rules, but the courage to accept responsibility for doing what you believed was right. That's the mark of a soldier, even if it's not always the mark of a Queen's Guard. As Michael left the sergeant major's office, he felt a strange mixture of pride and uncertainty. He had potentially saved a child's life, but he had also set in motion a chain of events that would challenge centuries of tradition and likely end his career in the Queen's Guard. The story was far from over, and the most difficult parts were yet to come. The video went viral within 6 hours. Sarah had kept her promise to make sure people knew what Michael had done. Before leaving the hospital where Tommy was recovering, she had uploaded her own phone footage to social media with a heartfelt message about the Queen's Guard who chose compassion over protocol. The video, shaky and emotional but powerfully authentic, showed Michael stepping out of formation and kneeling beside her unconscious son. By evening, the story had been picked up on major news outlets across the UK and internationally. The footage from tourist cameras provided multiple angles of the incident, and interviews with witnesses painted a picture of a soldier who had risked everything to save a child's life. Hashtag Guard with a Heart began trending on Twitter, and the story dominated evening news broadcasts. Michael, confined to base and prohibited from speaking to the media, could only watch as his life became a public spectacle. The coverage was overwhelmingly positive from a civilian perspective. People praised his humanity, his quick thinking, and his willingness to put human life above military rules. But Michael knew that public opinion, however favorable, would not necessarily influence a military tribunal. The reaction within the Queen's Guard was more complicated. Some of his fellow guards privately expressed support for his actions, understanding that any one of them might have made the same choice in similar circumstances. Others worried about how the incident would affect the reputation and mystique that had protected them for generations. The Queen's Guard had always been seen as something beyond ordinary humanity. Disciplined, unflappable, absolutely reliable. Michael's very human response challenged that carefully maintained image. 3 days after the incident, Michael received an unexpected visitor. Private Williams, who had been standing at the adjacent post when the emergency occurred, requested permission to speak with him privately. They met in a quiet corner of the base canteen during the evening meal. "I wanted you to know," Williams said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard, "that I saw the whole thing. I saw that woman with her child, and I heard what she was asking you to do." Michael nodded, but said nothing, not sure where this conversation was leading. "I've been thinking about it for 3 days," Williams continued. "I keep asking myself what I would have done in your position. I want to believe I would have helped, but honestly, I'm not sure I would have had the courage to break formation like you did." "It wasn't about courage," Michael replied. "It was just instinct. I saw a child who needed help, and I couldn't stand there and do nothing. But that's exactly what we're trained to do, stand there and do nothing no matter what happens around us. You chose differently, and now a child is alive who might not be if you had followed protocol." Williams paused, seeming to struggle with something he wanted to say. "There's something else you should know. Word is that several of the senior guards have been questioning whether our current protocols make sense in situations like this. Your situation has started conversations that probably needed to happen a long time ago." This was news to Michael. He had assumed that his actions would be seen purely as a breach of discipline, not as a catalyst for examining the rules themselves. The formal review began the following Monday in a conference room that Michael had never seen before, deep within the administrative wing of the palace. The panel consisted of 3 senior officers: Colonel Matthews, who commanded all ceremonial guards, Major General Roberts from the Ministry of Defense, and, to Michael's surprise, Lady Catherine Pemberton, a senior aide to members of the royal family. Michael stood at attention before the panel, wearing his dress uniform, but without the ceremonial elements that marked him as an active Queen's Guard. The weight of the moment was not lost on him. Decisions made in this room would likely determine not only his own future, but also set precedents for how similar situations would be handled in the years to come. Colonel Matthews opened the proceedings by reading the formal charges and explaining the purpose of the review. Then, surprisingly, he called Sarah as the first witness. Sarah entered the room carrying a folder and, accompanied by a man in a business suit whom she introduced as her solicitor. She had clearly prepared extensively for this appearance. After being sworn in, she addressed the panel directly. "Gentlemen, my lady," she began, her voice steady despite the intimidating setting. "I'm here because I want you to understand what happened from my perspective, and I want you to meet my son." She gestured toward the door, and a small boy entered the room. Tommy looked completely recovered from his ordeal, bright-eyed and curious about his surroundings. He was wearing his best clothes and carrying something in his small hands. Tommy wanted to come here today because he has something to say to the people making decisions about the man who saved his life. The panel members exchanged glances, clearly not having expected this type of presentation. Lady Pemberton leaned forward slightly, her expression softening as she looked at the small boy. "Tommy," Sarah prompted gently, "can you tell these people what you remember about that day at the palace?" Tommy stepped forward with the confidence that only small children seem to possess in formal situations. "I got sick and fell down," he said clearly. "Mummy was scared, but the Red Soldier Man helped me feel better. He was nice." Then Tommy approached the panel table and placed what he had been carrying on the surface. It was a drawing clearly made by a child, showing a figure in a red coat kneeling beside a much smaller figure. Above the drawing, in carefully printed letters that had obviously been helped along by an adult, were the words, "Thank you." "I made this for the soldier man," Tommy said. "Mummy says he might get in trouble for helping me, but I don't think helping people should get you in trouble." The room was completely silent for a moment. Colonel Matthews cleared his throat and accepted the drawing with surprising gentleness. "Thank you, Tommy," he said. "That's a very nice drawing, and you're a very brave boy." After Sarah and Tommy left, the panel called several witnesses who had observed the incident, including palace security personnel and tourists who had been present. The testimony painted a consistent picture: a child in medical distress, insufficient immediate medical response, and a guard who had acted quickly and competently to provide life-saving assistance. Then, Michael was called to testify on his own behalf. Guardsman Thompson, Colonel Matthews began, "You've heard the testimony about the events of September 15th. Do you have anything to add to the account of what happened?" "Sir, the accounts are accurate. I observed a child in apparent medical distress, assessed that immediate intervention was needed, and chose to provide assistance despite standing orders to maintain my post. Do you regret that choice?" Michael had thought extensively about this question during the long days of waiting for the review. "Sir, I regret that my actions caused complications for the Queen's Guard and raised questions about our discipline and reliability. But I do not regret helping to save a child's life." Major General Roberts leaned forward. "Guardsmen, you understand that military discipline depends on soldiers following orders even when they disagree with them or when circumstances seem to suggest alternative actions?" "Yes, sir. I understand that principle, and I have followed it faithfully throughout my service until this incident." "Then, why did you choose to disregard it in this case?" Michael took a breath before answering. "Sir, I believe that the principles underlying military discipline include protecting innocent life and serving the public good. In this specific situation, I judged that following standing orders would have violated those deeper principles." Lady Pemberton spoke for the first time. "Mr. Thompson, are you familiar with the historical purpose of the Queen's Guard's ceremonial duties?" "Yes, my lady. We represent the monarchy's connection to the people and serve as symbols of stability, discipline, and service. Do you believe that your actions on September 15th were consistent with those symbolic responsibilities?" This was perhaps the most challenging question Michael had faced. He thought carefully before responding. "My lady, I believe that true service to the monarchy means embodying the values that the crown represents, including compassion, protection of the vulnerable, and putting the welfare of the people above personal considerations. If our symbolic role requires us to ignore human suffering, then perhaps that symbolism needs to be re-examined." The panel asked several more questions about Michael's training, his understanding of regulations, and his assessment of alternative actions he might have taken. Throughout the questioning, Michael was struck by the fact that none of the panel members seemed hostile to his actions, even while they pressed him on the implications of his choices. After Michael's testimony concluded, the panel dismissed him while they deliberated. He spent the next 3 hours in a waiting room, alternating between confidence in his actions and worry about the consequences. Finally, he was called back into the conference room. Colonel Matthews stood to deliver the panel's decision. "Guardsman Thompson, this review has examined your actions on September 15th in the context of military regulations, the ceremonial role of the Queen's Guard, and the broader mission of service to the Crown and the people of the United Kingdom." Michael stood at attention, preparing for whatever verdict was coming. "The panel finds that you violated standing orders by abandoning your post and breaking formation without authorization. These actions constitute a serious breach of military discipline that cannot be overlooked." Michael's heart sank, but Colonel Matthews continued. "However, the panel also finds that your actions were motivated by a genuine emergency, required specialized skills that you possessed, and resulted in preserving human life. Furthermore, your conduct during this review has demonstrated continued respect for military authority and acceptance of responsibility for your choices." The colonel paused, and Michael sensed that the crucial moment was approaching. After extensive discussion, including consultation with senior palace officials, the panel has decided on the following resolution. You will receive a formal reprimand for breach of protocol, which will be entered into your service record. However, you will not face court-martial or dismissal from service. Instead, you will be transferred to a new position that has been created specifically in response to this incident. Michael felt his knees nearly buckle with relief, but Colonel Matthews wasn't finished. The Queen's Guard will be implementing new protocols for medical emergencies that occur during ceremonial duties. These protocols will allow guards to break formation to provide life-saving assistance when no other medical personnel are immediately available, but only after specific training and certification. You will be the first guard to receive this training and will serve as an instructor for other guards who volunteer for medical emergency certification. Lady Pemberton stood and addressed Michael directly. Mr. Thompson, I have been authorized to convey that members of the royal family have followed this situation closely. While they respect the importance of military discipline, they also believe that the monarchy must embody the highest values of service and compassion. Your actions on September 15th exemplified those values, and you will continue to serve with honor. As Michael left the conference room, he felt as though he had been given a second chance not just at his career, but at finding a way to serve that honored both military tradition and human decency. The new protocols that would result from his case would mean that future guards facing similar situations would have clear guidance instead of having to choose between conflicting duties. 6 months later, Michael stood in the same courtyard where his life had changed, but now he wore a slightly different uniform that marked him as a certified emergency response specialist within the Queen's Guard. He was training a group of volunteers in the new medical protocols when he noticed a familiar face among the tourists gathering to watch the changing of the guard. Sarah approached with Tommy, now completely healthy and even more fascinated by the red-coated soldiers than before. Tommy broke away from his mother and ran toward Michael with the fearless enthusiasm that only children possess. "It's the soldier man," Tommy called out, causing several tourists to turn and look. "Mummy, it's the man who helped me." Michael broke into a genuine smile as he knelt down to Tommy's level. "Hello there, soldier. How are you feeling?" "I'm good. Are you still a guard?" "I am indeed. And you know what? Now I help teach other guards how to help people, just like I helped you." Tommy's face lit up with delight. "So now lots of guards can help people." "That's right." Sarah approached and shook Michael's hand warmly. "I've been following your story in the news," she said. "I'm so glad everything worked out well. Tommy talks about you all the time. He says he wants to be a guard who helps people when he grows up." "Well," Michael said, looking down at the bright-eyed little boy, "I think he'd make an excellent guard. He's already proven he's brave." As Sarah and Tommy rejoined the crowd of tourists, Michael returned to his training session. The guards he was instructing listened intently as he explained the new protocols, understanding that they were learning skills that might one day save a life. Michael thought about how much had changed since that morning when he faced the most difficult choice of his military career. The Queen's Guard was still the disciplined, professional force it had always been, but now it was also something more, a service that acknowledged that true duty sometimes required human compassion to override rigid protocol. The tourists continued to photograph the guards and marvel at their discipline and precision. But now, some of them also knew that beneath those red coats and stoic expressions were real people, capable of extraordinary compassion when circumstances demanded it. The mystique remained, but it had been enhanced rather than diminished by the acknowledgement of the guards' humanity. As Michael watched his fellow guards practice the new emergency procedures, he reflected on the lesson he had learned. Sometimes the most important military action is the one that puts human life above all other considerations. The Queen's Guard would continue to stand motionless through rain and heat, protests and provocation, maintaining their centuries-old tradition of disciplined service. But now they would also be ready to step forward when someone needed help, knowing that true service to the crown meant serving the people with both unwavering discipline and unlimited compassion. The story of the guard who broke character to save a life had become something larger than one man's choice. It had become a new chapter in the long history of the Queen's Guard, one that honored both tradition and humanity, proving that the strongest discipline is the one that knows when to bend without breaking.